Hello everyone. Hope you can hear me. My name is Ashwini Kummireddy and I will be your moderator for today's session. I would like to welcome you to our second session for the day for Graduate Research Symposium. And since it's already one, let's start with the step session. A few housekeeping things before we start. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. And I will be introducing each speaker, and once introduced, they will have 15 minutes to share their presentation, leaving a little time at the end of their presentation for a couple of questions. And we encourage our audience to fully engage in the session and ask questions using the chat function or the microphone or unmuting your microphone. So our first talk will be presented by Jennifer Hammond, and she is from the Liberal Arts School, and her topic is on the opioid epidemic. So, Jennifer, please go on.
Hi, thanks for having me. I didn't do a PowerPoint because I wasn't sure how to put philosophy of language into pictures, so I'm just gonna speak. Okay, so the topic of my study is the opioid epidemic, and this was happening even before COVID, but now after COVID, the numbers have increased a lot. So my interest in this topic stemmed from my own experience of receiving opioid pain medications 1 year for a back injury. And then the next year, after re-injuring my back while snowboarding, I returned to the same spine doctor to get another prescription to temporarily relieve me from the debilitating pain. But to me, it felt as if within 1 year, the medical community had changed their philosophical approach towards treating patients, an approach that went from trying to help patients relieve pain, assuming that any patient who comes in with pain is a drug seeker. My only option, according to this physician, was back surgery. I was in my late 20s, and so I was way too young for this. And I left stunned and started my slow, painful road to recovery on my own. So just before the COVID-19 pandemic shut down many of our places of work, school, and social interactions, the opioid epidemic was spreading throughout the US. In March of 2019, the CDC estimated that there were over 47,000 deaths from opioid overdoses. The most recent data from October 2021 estimates that there are now close to 76,000 deaths. There are several conjectures as to why this number has greatly increased in the past few years. One of them being the recent introduction of fentanyl-laced pain medications on the streets, where users are often unaware of how much, if any, is in the product. Other social and economic reasons are often ignored or covered up with temporary band-aid policies supported by our government, big pharma, and in turn, our media. We will get to some of these reasons later, but first I want to briefly describe what's currently happening. In the book Dreamland, A True Tale of America's Opioid Epidemic, journalist Sam Quinones details the rise and fall of narcotics in the US, influenced heavily by political and medical agendas. Quinones' narrative is a journey of black tar heroin grown and produced in Mexico, then distributed, quote, like a pizza delivery service all over US cities. It was, quote, the happy meal of dope, marketed like fast food to young people. The allure of the feeling of euphoria was spreading like wildfire to suburban kids looking for a way to fulfill their dreams of adventure that they had not found in their quiet towns. Quote, like no other particle on earth, Quinones said, the morphine molecule seemed to possess heaven and hell, a way for people to find complete happiness and freedom from pain, but for a deadly cost. So this is going to be from like a medical perspective for how people get hooked on opioid medications. So a patient, for example, has a medical procedure. Maybe they get their wisdom teeth taken out. They used to be given a large bottle of pain medication, typically an opioid such as Percocet or Vicodin. Some patients would only use them when they felt unbearable pain, while others would use the whole bottle. Some of those who use the whole bottle would feel as if they could not fall asleep without a pill and would wean themselves off on their own, perhaps by taking only half a pill at night until they could sleep without one. Others, however, enjoyed the feeling of euphoria and the rush of pleasure, so much so that they would seek out more medication, even if their pain had subsided. When a patient does this, they are referred to as drug seekers by the medical profession. These drug seekers are addicted and will either find a physician who will continue to prescribe them these medications or seek it out on the black market. Today, this black market is flooded with narcotics that are often laced with fentanyl, a highly addictive synthetic drug that if one takes too much of it, they could overdose and die. Though the medical perspective is true in many, many ways, it doesn't account for other social, economic, and political reasons for wanting to temporarily escape from our lives. For now, let's turn to the word narcotic and briefly see how its meaning has evolved throughout time. In ancient Greece, Hippocrates, who is often referred to as the father of medicine, described the agent narcosis as one that induced numbness in the body. The term narcotic was later coined by the Greek physician Galen, where he referred to it as the agent that prompted sleep, relieved pain, and dulled the senses. This term used to describe a illicit substance, one that was openly available to the public for medical use. Narcotics has at many points in its history been accepted as an appropriate agent to remedy ailments. This is not to say that it did not or does not have the potential for addiction and abuse. It is simply to show that the meaning of the term narcotics has morphed dramatically. In the past 3 decades, the term narcotics has essentially become a contronym of antinomy, representing 2 opposite meanings depending on the context. So on one side, it exists as a commonly accepted and appropriate pain reliever, but on the other side, it's a highly addictive illicit drug. These 2 opposing meanings emerge from 2 very different paradigms of thought, the former from a medical understanding and the latter from a political and social perception. Some linguists refer to these words as Janus-like terms. In ancient Roman myth, the deity Janus symbolizes beginnings and ends, passageways in time, peace and war. He is often depicted as having 2 faces, looking both to the future and to the past. Languages are riddled with terms that have multiple meanings. Contronyms, taken as a class of words, incite a feeling of ambiguity, causing confusion, and failing to support the clear and concise exchange of communication, which is the point of language. The phenomenology of language is interested in the processes and structures of consciousness with respect to our experiences and the influences they have on our linguistic systems used to describe and communicate these same experiences. The German analytic philosopher and logician Gottlieb Frege was notable for differentiating between the linguistic notion of sense and that of reference. So all terms have a sense, or a method in which objects or experiences are expressed. Frege's reference indicates that the same object can have more than one sense. So reference indicates a term's truth value, and its sense is the thought that it expresses. So that's a mouthful. So for example, the word narcotics that is used to identify the substance is its reference. While its senses are many, it has changed from an everyday sleep aid to an illegal, dangerous drug. It is commonly accepted that human language reflects human thought. Language is a mirror of the self when used to describe the experience of apperception. Discoveries of the philosophy of language are relevant to the philosophy of mind. It is proposed here that the existence and nature of Janus-like expressions are a reflection of a unique and significant construct of our linguistic phenomenological process. The construct is that human language is simply incomplete in its ability to encode or express certain uniquely human phenomenal experiences. Human language is limited because human reason is limited. But if the analogy or metaphor for the moment is plausible, then the existence of Janus-like expressions reflects a peculiar propensity of human reason to seek completeness, even at the expense of logical consistency. In other words, human reason is willing to accept a phenomenal semantic rule or axiom that is inconsistent with the initial set of truth-preserving semantic axioms, that it is acceptable in certain cases or phenomenal experiences that a word or sign can possess 2 contradictory references at the same time. Language is a tool that is constantly evolving to improve our expressive efficacy in capturing all of our new phenomenological experiences. To do this, many languages include Janus-like contronyms. Narcotic is a perfect example of a term that is inconsistent with the goal of truth preservation in human language. Noam Chomsky takes this idea even further as he explains why the media and government have manipulated terms and concepts into something that is, quote, far too difficult for the average person to comprehend. One might even argue that to deal with substantive issues in the ideological disciplines may be a dangerous thing, because these disciplines are not simply concerned with discovering and explaining the facts as they are. Rather, they tend to present these facts and interpret them in a manner that conforms to certain ideological requirements, and to become dangerous to established interests if they do not do so. So I want to kind of get into a little bit of possible root causes that are not necessarily chemical dependency and the result of drug seekers. I emphasize the word epidemic instead of pandemic because this is a uniquely American problem. Nowhere else in the world is opioid use as rampant and problematic. One plausible reason for this could be that opioid use in the US affects all ages and found in nearly every socio-demographic group. Most significantly, it affects our vulnerable populations, such as those in economically depressed areas of the country. But vulnerable populations can be any individual, depending on their context. For example, opioid addiction has also been growing among white middle-class women who have families, a comfortable income, and a nice home in the suburbs. One might ask, why this population? For most, drug and alcohol use are often an escape from reality, a temporary pause on individual experiences of anxiety, depression, or feeling overwhelmed by work, family, or lack of financial security. Any person can experience stress and anxiety. In our current culture of having access to instant information with a fix-it-quick mentality, these substances are easy to find and easy to cover up these unwanted emotions. Economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton calls it, quote, a disease of despair. Overdoses, alcoholism, and suicide are caused by the loss of industrial and other blue-collar jobs that might have predisposed residents to using drugs. The Guardian journalist Mark Lewis notes that, quote, addiction is not caused by drug availability. The abundant availability of alcohol doesn't turn us all into alcoholics. Addiction is caused by psychological and economic suffering, especially in childhood and adolescence. The US is at or near the bottom of the developed world in its record on child welfare and child poverty. No wonder there's an addiction problem, end quote. It could also be our lack of genuine community. We are involved in so many activities and experience pressure to perform well at work, school, sports, or the arts that it can often feel overwhelming. The US purports a fair capitalistic market that is at the heart of our democracy, but it also engenders a competitive nature where we must always win and come out on top. Quinone states, quote, all of a sudden, we can't go to college without Adderall. You can't do athletics without testosterone, and you can't have intimacy without Viagra. Americans seem to be so focused on technology and medications to find total happiness, they forget that they are living, emotional, and psychological individuals who have operated without these crutches for centuries. I'm going to end with a couple of possible solutions. There are a number of plausible and effective medical solutions to the opioid crisis, including the injection of naloxone for reversing overdoses in emergency situation, medication-assisted treatment such as methadone clinics, and safe injection sites for heroin users. Journalist Maddie Quinn suggests that these are merely surface-level solutions. Quote, the opioid crisis is a jobs crisis. It's an affordable housing crisis. The same forces that have reshaped the economy over the past decade have left a void that's been filled in many places by opioids. Substance addiction is a way to escape the world, a world that has deliberately fostered craving and fear, shaped by our politics, media, and mega organizations. Addiction is a constant yearning for what we think others have, and thus what we desire. The family across the street or the cool kid at school seem to have it all. What exactly is it that we desire? Constant happiness? America has and will continue to talk about the opioid crisis in the wrong way until leaders from various public sectors merge to discuss far more plausible social solutions. These social solutions are evidently way more expensive. In the midst of these discussions, there exists an often hidden root cause of this pain-free obsession, the misuse or misunderstanding of words and the intentional abuse of language. When the media, government, big pharma, and the medical sectors push for a single meaning of a particular term like narcotic, it is often for the purposes of controlling the social narrative and influencing the phenomenological perceptions of individuals. The success of the manipulation of language is due in part to the very dualistic nature of Janus-like contronyms. They simultaneously symbolize both our vulnerable propensity for completeness and expression with our language and the potential power of human creativity. Perhaps the opioid crisis is rooted in abandoning the challenges of understanding the ineffable through chemical escapism. One's reaction to an experience can be either positive or negative. A positive reaction is represented by our uniquely human desire to wonder or seek out experiences of awe, which can be creative and enlightening. A negative reaction is illustrated by the opioid epidemic, which fosters malicious skepticism. One seeks to offer solutions through the discovery of truth, while the other tends to destroy it. In the current American political Orwellian universe, where the average listener is challenged with the modern morass of information and common contronyms, doublespeak thrives. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was a really great talk. There were some deep thoughts in it, and I'm sure there are some questions. Since we have already reached 1:15, I can at least ask for at least one question, and then we will move on to the second speaker.
Sure.
So anyone has any question for Jennifer?
Nobody else has anything. Just more of a comment. Jennifer, great presentation. I really appreciate that. I appreciate you shedding light on this subject because it's still very misunderstood in our society. I have an old roommate. He got addicted to Percocet from a football injury, you know, and it's just like, it's very easy to misunderstand and be like, man, how did you get there, right? Like, but you explained how it's a combination of the addictive nature of the drugs, societal influence, you know, and I appreciate how you tie those things together because it's not just mutually exclusive, you know, it's a factors and things go into it. So I appreciate your perspectives on it and thank you for sharing.
Sure, yeah, thanks for commenting.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. So our next presenter is Kathleen Birch, and she is also from the School of Liberal Arts. Her topic today is gendered norms in community-based engagement. So Kathleen, please take it away.
Sorry, 1 second. Just trying to minimize this so it doesn't show. Hi, everyone. My name is Kathleen Birch, and I'm a public history master's student in the Department of History at Duquesne University. And my paper is titled Gendered Norms and Community-Based Engagement, Oral Histories of the Women in the Elsinore Benu Think Tank for Restorative Justice. So before I get into my paper, I just want to introduce the EBTT, which is how I will refer to them throughout this presentation, as that is how they're often referred to as well. They are a local Pittsburgh group that engages in restorative justice. They comprise of returning citizens, professors, lawyers, police officers, and other local professionals. And then there is also a working group of the EBTT, which is the Big Idea Team. So for my methodology, I used an oral history methodology. This project actually originated in a class I took in the fall with Dr. Jennifer Taylor, and it was an oral history class. And I kind of took this project that in the paper that I wrote for this presentation are a branch off of that original class project. So I continue with the oral history methodology because that was the original methodology we used in our class. And this methodology really enables authentic conversations between narrators and interviewers. And so the narrators in this case are the people who are being interviewed. And the goal is to capture the stories and experiences of the narrators. Instead of just doing a regular interview like perhaps a journalist would do, oral histories really, really provide a conversation for the two people who are engaging in it, and an opportunity for traumatic experiences to come out, for personal experiences, for pauses. It's a really just supposed to be a very safe place to express different things in your life. And so each one of my narrators for my paper highlights the impact women have had on these traditionally male-dominated spaces. And the goal of their oral histories is to illuminate how gender impacts the EBTT and Inside Out classes. So my oral history narrators are Dr. Kathleen Appelt, who teaches at Duquesne University. She is a professor in the sociology department, and she is also the Big Idea Team facilitator. Then I interviewed two other women who are also in the EBTT, who teach at Slippery Rock University, and they are Dr. Sarah Kuhn, who is also a professor and criminologist, and she teaches Inside Out classes in some of the different state correctional institutions throughout Pennsylvania. And then I also interviewed Dr. Cindy Lacombe, who is an English professor. She's the director of the Gender Studies program at her university, and she focuses on juvenile justice initiatives. Before I move on, I do want to define a couple terms that I use in my paper and that the EBTT uses as well. The first one is returning citizens. Sometimes they are also referred to as returned citizens. And these are previously incarcerated men and women returning to society after jail and/or prison. And then restorative justice is the process of healing broken relationships and communities harmed by crime, in which the victim, offender, and the community come together to resolve the harm done and discuss its implications for the future. So restorative justice is really at the heart of what the EBTT does. And for each of these women, this is what they are engaging in as part of this organization. And in their oral histories, they really express to me
to wait to get it.
They really express to me how
And
important it is to engage in restorative justice in appropriate ways. My research questions were, how does gender affect the EBTT and Inside Out classes? And how does the role of gender change or challenge these traditionally male-dominated spaces? And then the argument for my paper is, traditional male-dominated spaces, such as what society views as typical mass incarceration, we often think of men when we think of mass incarceration, are challenged by women entering this space. My three oral history narrators' relationships with the returning citizens have a gendered component. I also want to talk about a couple of the sources I used in my paper. These were the two most important sources. First one is Kimberly Crenshaw's work. It's titled From Private Violence to Mass Incarceration, Thinking Intersectionally About Women, Race, and Social Control. And something that's really important from her work is that she defines mass incarceration as being gendered as male. So that's just going to kind of put into context what we think of when we think of mass incarceration and how we think of the women in the EBTT interacting with returning citizens who were all male. And then the second source that was really important that I used was Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And she discusses how mass incarceration has been so normalized in our society that if you're not involved with it in any aspect, either in community engagement or yourself as a returning citizen, or perhaps you work with people in prisons, that you really just don't, it's not a topic that people necessarily think about on an everyday basis. So for my first oral history narrator, I'd like to discuss Dr. Kathleen Appelt. I interviewed her 2 different times, and her area of expertise is healthcare and aging. Like I said, she is a professor, and she is the facilitator of the Big Idea Team. And some of the things that came out in her oral history were the gender norms in her working group, which is the Big Idea Team, how change societal norms for women have affected the returning citizens in not only the EBTT, but also several of them are in her working group, and then the impact of incarceration on women and communities. So the driving principle of Dr. Kathleen Appelt's work with the EBTT is to create intergenerational cohesion between the male returning citizens, herself, and the many members, including Duquesne students, that form the Big Idea team. This is a group that formed during the pandemic. They are a virtual group, so that also layers in a different component to how they function. And as the facilitator of the Big Idea team, Dr. Appelt has noticed the way in which the male returning citizens interact with herself, the students, and one another. As mostly men in their 70s, having served long sentences, some men have served between 49 and 50 years. The change in societal norms is an aspect she pointed to in her oral history. The Big Idea team crosses many generations. We have people in their 50s, people in their 70s, people in their 20s. So there is a lot of intergenerational work, and all the returning citizens in this group are male. And there are a lot of women students in the group, and then both facilitators of the Big Idea team, which is Dr. Appelt and Terry Baltimore, they're also both women. So you can kind of just see how the dynamics of change societal norms for women impact this group, because when these men went to prison, women did not hold the same leadership roles necessarily in society, especially not in university settings as commonly as they do now. And interacting with the men in the group, Dr. Appelt says, you know, even simple things like how they address her versus to how the students address her. There are so many different gendered aspects to how we say people's names, how we either call them ma'am or we call them by their actual name. And a lot of the times the men use very formal ways of addressing her and Terry Baltimore compared to how the students or other members of the group would address her. And part of this difference is that when these male citizens went to prison, women just had more traditional roles in society. The changes in women's roles in society since the time the men became incarcerated are different. Women have more leadership roles, like I said before. They're just in a different place than they were 50 years ago. Not only are these interactions different, but Dr. Appelt highlights the role many of the non-returning citizens who are women play in the group. She says that many of them, including herself, take on traditional female roles like organizing events. Not that this is a given, it's just something women do tend to do. And this is definitely reflected in the EBTT and in the Big Idea team. And like I said, it's not required. It is more so a function of societal norms creeping in to community-based engagement groups. And one example she pointed to in her second oral history is in reference to a meeting I attended. And in this meeting, the 4 returning citizens in the Big Idea team were all men. And there was mostly women in the group that day. They were talking about how one returning citizen was talking about how, you know, what happens when all the men in the communities are gone? Who was left to raise all the children? And then we have a very gendered component coming in there. You have the mothers, the grandmothers, the aunts, family, friends, when all the men are leaving due to mass incarceration. So my next oral history narrator was Dr. Sarah Kuhn, and she is professor at Slippery Rock. She's also a criminologist. And what I found really interesting about her is she is an inside out instructor. And inside out instructors go into state correctional institutions and they bring a group of students with them from their university, and they engage in classes mostly with lifers. So people who are serving life sentences, and these people have to be chosen for these classes. And she described how in these groups, especially when she first started, she would come into the room and she said she's pretty tall, but she just described herself as not being as physically imposing as perhaps a male inside out instructor would be. And just the difference in that of having to earn the respect of these men, given that she's a woman and that her physical stature is different, really sets the tone for these experiences within the inside out classes. And she described it as having to really take a lot more time to build this trust, to be able to have the students build the trust with the inside students, which is what they are referred to. And she also pointed to the fact that most of the students she brings to Inside Out classes are young, white, and female. And generally, in her experience, most of the men who take Inside Out classes in prison are Black, they're of an older generation. And so you have two differences here. You have male, you have female, you have differences in race, you have differences in age, and all of these are coming together. And you have to really figure out how you're going to build a cohesive environment, and an environment where instruction and empathy and learning can really take place. And in her oral history, she also talked about how she's not there to be the white savior. This is not an appropriate thing for her to do. And then as far as stereotypes of mass incarceration, a lot of resources go to men's prisons as opposed to women's prisons. And this really does tie into the whole fact that when we think of mass incarceration, we think of men, we don't think of women. And then my last oral history narrator was Dr. Cindy Lacombe. She is an English professor and the director of the Gender Studies program at Slippery Rock. And she has extensive work in domestic abuse and violence. She talked about how she had worked at the Allegheny County Jail. And one of the biggest things she pointed to in her oral history is that the returning citizens went to prison when gender was binary. You had you were either male or female. Now gender is very fluid. And this has a profound impact on how we think of community-based engagement with these women and the returning citizens, and how we think of mass incarceration overall. Again, going back to what some of my other oral history narrators said, we think of mass incarceration so much as men, but we also need to think about it as women. And then just wrapping up, I know I'm over my time. All three of my oral history narrators pointed to the fact that there are no women returning citizens in this group, and that there is a need for this, and that they are hoping that they are going to be able to do this. And then for further research, I really just want to explore the impact of using oral history as a methodology, and really the need for systemic change at federal, state, and local levels, and how I can add to the gendered narrative of mass incarceration. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and start. I started my, okay. So my presentation is on the lived experience of intensive care unit nurses during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is a mini study I did last summer with my advisor, Dr. Zuha. So there are many challenges that ICU nurses are currently facing. It is important to explore the experiences of the nurses that are providing care to ICU patients during this time to understand their perspective of what being an ICU nurse during the pandemic was like. Many nurses are leaving the bedside now, and more must be understood about what transpired during the COVID-19 pandemic for the bedside ICU nurse. There is a gap in the literature regarding the experience of the ICU nurse providing care during the pandemic. Lumley discussed that unprecedented patient numbers needing ICU has caused hospitals to increase bed capacity and utilize staffing models that have not been seen before, and to change medical strategies. In an article written by Rose, it was suggested that visiting restrictions are causing moral injury to intensive care staff for whom in-person emotional support of family members throughout their loved one's critical illness is integral to professional practice. Video conferencing tools have been adopted by healthcare staff to communicate with patients' family members. However, utilizing this mode of communication poses its own challenges. It's important to provide nurses the opportunity to share their experiences in order to potentially care for the caregiver, as well as improving the care of the COVID patients. It is imperative to understand the lived experiences of the ICU nurse and to understand the current state of nursing during these difficult times. Understanding how the pandemic has affected nurses will not only help the current workforce, but allow for better preparation for the possibility of future pandemics, and as well as we all know, this ongoing pandemic. So the purpose of my study, The purpose of my study was to understand the experiences of the ICU nurses working at the bedside during the COVID-19 pandemic that provided care. My research question was, what was the lived experience of the ICU nurse working at the bedside during the COVID-19 pandemic? So this was a descriptive phenomenological approach. Phenomenology can be described as a method that offers a descriptive, reflective, interpretive, and engaging mode of inquiry that the researcher may elicit the core of an experience. The approach that was used in this study was a hermeneutical phenomenology. With this approach, knowledge comes into being through language and understanding. The descriptive method is used to give a clear picture of what is going on, and data was collected using an open-ended question interview guide. Data was obtained by conducting individual interviews via Zoom. Demographic data was obtained via Qualtrics, such as gender, age, education level, and years of experience as a nurse. An open-ended question interview guide that I created was utilized to gather data regarding the participants' experiences, and this was over Zoom video conference. The first question I asked them was, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? And then I asked them, I'm interested in learning about your experience as an ICU nurse during the COVID-19 pandemic. I then asked, what was it like for you? And further questioning, what have your experiences been? And then I ended my interview with, is there anything else that we have not covered that you would like to add? So inclusion criteria were they had to be registered nurses that were practicing or are still practicing at the bedside as ICU nurses during the COVID-19 pandemic. They obviously had to be over the age of 18. There was no limitation as to experience level or the type of nurse, type of ICU that they worked in. Nurses serving in supervisory or in educational roles in the ICU were excluded though. Data was collected in one individual interview, and each participant had an interview via Zoom. I used in vivo 12 to utilize my data management and use that for analysis. And then I analyzed my data using Giorgio's 5 basic steps. In the first step, verbal data will be collected. And then in the second step, the researcher rereads the obtained transcripts before the new interview to ensure familiarity with any emerging themes and ensure that you have a strong understanding of the data. In the third step, data will be broken into parts or themes. The fourth step requires organization and expression of the data. And then in the fifth and final step, synthesis and summary of the data is completed for the purposes of sharing with the scholarly community. So my findings, I had a sample size of 3 ICU nurses, and they were all previously practicing at the bedside during the COVID-19 pandemic. They were all Caucasian females aged 25 to 44. One had an associate's degree, 2 had bachelor's degrees, and between them, they had 10 to 16 years of experience in nursing each. Initial data resulted in 6 break-in codes, and these were anger, lack of PPE, poor patient outcomes, sadness, safe environment, and unsupported. The data was then further analyzed into 4 organized nursing codes of grief and sadness, lack of organizational support, patient care delivery, and safe work environment. In grief and sadness, they discussed feelings of sadness, anger, depression, and feeling traumatized. One nurse had already sought therapy, and another nurse cried throughout the entire interview and stated she knew she needed to seek help with these feelings. The nurses discussed that the organization took all of their support staff away. Some were cleaning their own rooms, passing trays, and transporting patients, all in the presence of an overwhelmed ICU. They felt abandoned by leadership and regulatory organizations such as Joint Commission. The nurses spoke about poor patient care delivery due to doctors not wanting to go into the rooms, not willing to order tests that normally would be done, and feeling no family at bedside to make decisions, and they had inappropriate patient assignments. Regarding safe work environment, they all spoke about lack of PPE, reusing PPE until the point that they knew they were not being protected, and feeling scared to go home and possibly expose their families. All 3 nurses surveyed had left the bedside, and 2 of the 3 stated they would not go back to the bedside nursing in the ICU. One stated that she would if conditions improved. So conclusions and implications. I think that this initial data warrants further study. Further research must be done to better understand if initial data correlates to a broader nursing population. This research could have implications to the general well-being of ICU nurses after caring for patients during the COVID-19 pandemic, and potentially why they are leaving the bedside. So interestingly enough, I just saw a study 2 days ago that just came out in the March edition of the American Journal of Critical Care. They sent out surveys from October 2020 through early January 2021 through social media and the American Association of Critical Care Nurses. 3 open-ended questions focused on the experience of the ICU nurse during the pandemic. They had 285 responses. And in their study, nurses reported stress related to lack of evidence-based treatment, poor patient prognosis, lack of family presence in the ICU. Nurses perceived inadequate leadership support and inequity within the healthcare team. Lack of consistent community support to slow the spread of COVID-19 or recognition that COVID-19 was real increased nurses' feelings of isolation. Nurses reported physical and emotional symptoms, including exhaustion, anxiety, sleeplessness, and moral distress. Fear of contracting COVID-19 or infecting family and friends was also prevalent. So having read this, it correlates to the findings that I found with my 3 nurses. So that really solidified what I found. And then here are my references, and that's all I have. If anybody has any questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rong. Can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for confirming. I just joined with my phone. Okay, so if anyone has any questions for Ms. Rong, please go ahead.
I have one question for you. I'm wondering, and maybe I missed it, but did any of the informants that you interviewed, were they all, did any of them not believe in the virus, or did they ever talk about, working with people who didn't believe in it?
None of them discussed their coworkers not believing in it, but they did discuss in the community's response. One of them said that she had to get off social media because it would really make her anxious and angry. And so she couldn't read responses and discussions from other people, but nobody they worked with closely disregarded what was happening.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen, for your question. So if no one else has any questions, let's move on to our last presenter for this session. It's by Carl Jankart, and his presentation will be based on infant sleep and in relation to attention.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. Hi, my name is Carl Jankart, and I am Dr. Harborn's graduate assistant in the Infant Development Lab at Duquesne University. And my presentation today will be on infant sleep as a moderator and the relationship between sitting and focused attention. We currently don't have full results at this time for this study, so I'm kind of reporting out what we have right now. And listed below the title here are the names of all the great people within the infant lab at Duquesne, as well as Dr. Sarah Berger at the bottom, or at the last there, who is a professor at City University of New York, who we have collaborated with on this project. And I'm trying to get this changed. There we go. So wanted to go and also note that we received funding for this project through the National Science Foundation. And as I said, we do this research in conjunction with a lab at the City University of New York. So the overall aims of this project were to study the role of sleep in motor learning. So as children have acquired the skill of sitting, how that new skill impacts their physical coordination and movement. And one of the goals of this sub-project that I'm talking about today is to determine if sleep moderates the relationship between postural control and sitting and focused attention. So initially, we had plans to do this, this study in person, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we kind of had to switch up our plans, and we conducted these sessions through Zoom. So we conducted them virtually. So first I wanted to talk about how we measured sleep. We used the NANET, which is a form of video sonography, and it uses infrared camera that, that is placed over the crib and has an app associated with it where you can actually just select where the crib is within relationship to the camera. And you can actually scroll back through all the data that it collects. And some of the things that some of the data that is collected through the NANET are when the infant starts to sleep, when they wake up in the morning, the frequency at which they have night wakings, and the time at the duration for how long they're actually awake for these night wakings. And finally, if the parents have actually visited in the room. So it collects a number of different pieces of infant sleep. We also measured postural control and focused attention. And focused attention was measured using 3 different toys that were placed in front of the infant for 90 seconds each, as you can see to the top right picture there, for examples. And focused attention, what we were looking for in the coding, because these videos that were used afterwards were coded. We're looking for gaze, serious facial expression while the infant was actually looking at the toy. We were looking at the toy like in proximity to the infant's face so that they were facing toward the object and it was close, and that they had a stilled body, so they weren't exhibiting any types of extraneous movements, and that they were quiet. So that's really what we were looking for with focused attention. With postural control, we took the velocity through having one of the caregivers actually lift the infant up from under their armpits and then releasing them down. And so we took that sway, that amount of the degree to which they actually moved whenever they were dropped, and calculated the, as I said, the velocity with that information. So what we see here are just some results for between postural control and focused attention. We saw here with this smaller sample, this piece of our of what has come in so far, that as the average angle increases, the average level of focused attention decreases. So there is a negative correlation here that's moderate in strength. And this is indicative of that whenever there is more sway, that there is this tax on attention that may be that taxes infants' ability to actually attend to the to the focused attention task. And we actually, there was another study that was done, or another research, I don't even know if you would call it a study, I guess more so just another project that was done where we had information about the infants as they were in a seated condition, they were in a chair, versus seated without a chair. So within that project, it was actually it showed that infants who were seated within a chair were able to show greater focused attention than those that were seated without that support. So one of the reasons that we're interested in looking at sleep as a moderator is that we can see the benefits of sleep on memory in infancy, which is really important for their learning. And sleep has also been shown to impact executive functioning in infants and younger children. And sleep is kind of a complex variable to look into, because it may be counterintuitive at times, such as it's been found that having no night wakings actually can be not so good for learning skills, which is just not, it's kind of ironic. And so there's some complexity there with sleep. And one of the things that we also hope to do is to gather information about children who were born premature, who may be at risk for developmental disabilities, because a lot of the sleep research that's been done has been kind of extrapolated. Some people may extrapolate from adult research saying that it may be the same for infants, but that may not be the case. And so not only are we is more research warranted for infants, but also infants who may be at risk for developmental disabilities. And so that's why we're also looking more into infants who have been born premature. And it has been shown that focused attention is related to children with cerebral palsy's postural control as they're acquiring their ability to sit. And that this information would be very helpful in terms of better understanding children's development, particularly if they are receiving early intervention services. So collecting information and being able to provide recommendations for children who are receiving intervention and about their sleep would be really great. So that's what we kind of hope to do with the information that we received from this study. And that's it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Carl? Okay, I can ask one question if you can hear me.
Yep, I can
Yeah,
hear you.
okay. Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to confirm. Okay, so I noticed that you are considering premature children and the children who are born like on time. But are you considering if there are any gender differences between male infants and female infants, or is that what you is this something that you are planning to look into in future studies?
So I don't know if Reggie is on here. She may be, but
I think
it's funny you ask about that because we were just talking about that not long ago. The gender differences, so far there really don't seem to be great differences like that early on. So, I mean, it's something that we may look at. You may have noticed that I just put the sample of 20. I didn't show you which gender. And I think that really just had to do with that because there's just such few differences at that time, but I'm sure it's something that we'll look into, but I'm not sure if we will really expect to see much difference because the children are so young.
Yeah, we usually just quickly eliminate that as a possibility right at the beginning, just compare the two genders, there's no difference, move on, and then treat it as one group. So we'll check it, but it's not usually the thing.
Okay.
I just have a real quick comment. I adopted my son. He is about 15 months now. We adopted him straight from the hospital. He was premature. He was born at 35 weeks, and we have the Nanit. And I think the Nanit itself provided great information. And it helped me kind of have some peace of mind as well. But yeah, it gave us great information. And like you said about even the Nanit says that sleeping through the night isn't exactly ideal for their development, and that it's almost, I guess not good, but better if they do have at least 1 or 2 wake ups. So that was really interesting to learn as well. So yeah, I love the Nanit. I'm glad you guys used it.
Thanks so much for your comment. I appreciate that. It is strange, isn't it? Like it doesn't seem like I said, it's not really intuitive that waking up would be good, but it appears so.
Right.
At least within that scenario we're talking about some yeah.
I think just as a shout out to Nanit, they've been really helpful to us, giving us Nanits to use, and also being blasts out to the people who have a Nanit to try to recruit for us. So it's been a nice partnership between a commercial product provider and an academic endeavor.
That's awesome. Yeah, I really like mine. And like I said, he's 15 months, so I'm gonna have to let go of the breathing band soon, but I'm not quite ready.
Well, thank you everyone for actively participating in this session. And a special thanks to the presenters. Yeah. So with this, I would like to end the session. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.